Hey everybody, John Moore here, and I am a shamanic practitioner and teacher from the state of Maine in the US. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the term, and this is pronounced in different ways: seiðr, 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 scythe, however you want to, however you want to pronounce it, and spelled in different ways depending on which language is pronouncing it, as a form of Norse shamanism. Now, my expertise is in shamanism. I have a lot of background in Scandinavian folk magic, scythe as well, or seiðr. Um, so I'm going to talk about it from that perspective. And I know there's a lot of discussion, the background in Norse, there's a lot of background discussion in Norse religious practices and things like that because there's not a lot that was written down, and things that were written down tended to be written down by people who were Christian. So Snorri Sturluson, for example, famous author, wrote one of the Eddas, was Christian, as were most of the things written down in hindsight. So I'm going to talk about what we know about Seidr, and also there are a lot of people who are reconstructing the practice. And is it, I'll leave it up to you to decide, is it really important to be completely historically accurate, which is actually probably impossible at this point, since we don't know everything and probably never will. But through, researching literature, through archaeological digs and stuff, we can learn more and more and more. So let's talk about the word scythe. There's a lot of disagreement about the word origins. Some people would describe it as coming from the word to seethe or boil. Seethe not as in the furiousness of a person, but seethe as in the old meaning of a pot boiling. But there's also discussion that it comes from the words for seeing or saying or, whatever. And so you know, people can debate all of that where it came from, but it's a term and we're using it today, and it was used in some of the old writings. So, what was it Norse shamanism? Let's answer that question. So again, this is going to depend on your definition of shamanism. There were people who practiced seiðr as a form of divination that used altered states, communicated with helping spirits, and went to the different spirit worlds in the Norse tradition. So those three components in my book define shamanism. That being said, scythe was a practice that included all forms of it was used as a term to describe all forms of sort of magic and divination. So there were things, so we could call it a shamanistic practice, but there were certainly elements of shamanism in it and elements that weren't. So let's talk about what we know. So there were people who were went by different terms, who were soothsayers, or fortune tellers is not exactly the right word for it. These were revered, in fact, feared people. So there are different terms for them. One is Volva, which has been translated as witch or sorceress. Vitki, which would be a witch or sorcerer, male, warlock, whatever term you want to define there. Volva being a female, Vitki being a male. But there's also, scythe konam, which is a woman who does scythe, or scythe mother, which is a man who does scythe. So there were lots and lots of different terms. And again, like, Norse is not a singular culture. There were people who spoke Old Norse, but there were divisions, the family divisions and tribal divisions and land divisions and all kinds of stuff. Plus, in certain areas, belief systems that came from indigenous people, that known as the Sami these days, came in to the practice. So these terms were used to describe all different forms of magic and divination, but there was a role for somebody to do what we call high seat seiðr, right? High seat was a ritual in which an entire community would participate in. The person who was doing the scythe, the vulva usually, sometimes, a lot of the time this was a woman, and I'll talk about that in a second as well, would sit on a seat that was on a raised dais and would have attendants. That person would go into trance and would answer questions or things of pressing nature for the community. That person was channeling a god, usually a god or goddess, right? In that respect, there are aspects of both shamanism and mediumship here, right? In the way that I that I learned this process was very mediumistic, in that I'm not necessarily being taken over by the spirit, but I'm having a conversation with it and relaying information. That being said, there were probably people who were completely entranced, trance channeling, being taken over by spirit, or otherwise known as horsed by the spirit. I don't know if they use that in Old Norse, but that is an expression that's used in some traditions. Being horsed by a spirit, allowing your body to be used by a spirit. In this case, usually gods or goddesses, or some other divine things. This is very similar to the Greek oracles, if you think about how they worked, right? They were a representative of a particular god or goddess, and people would come in to ask questions, and they would go into an altered state, sometimes from breathing methane gas over a volcanic vent, but they would go into an altered state and do divination that way, deliver answers that way. So same thing is true for scythe. Now there is lots and lots and lots of magical practice that comes from the Norse. And when many people think of the Norse, they think of Vikings, right? Because the Vikings were the ones that went everywhere. And so there are records of scythe happening in places like Ireland and Scotland and England, right? Because, the Vikings raided into those places. But Norse culture is much, much, longer than simply, the Viking Age. The Viking Age was a period of time in which this, Viking as an activity was happening, right? And and again, like nothing was particularly written down until the Christian era, which was post-Viking era. It was written down. There's a lot of stuff in comes to us from Iceland, where the sagas come from, which are stories about the gods and goddesses. And there were some sagas written down, which were sort of families writing down, this is what happened to my family. And so there's some mythologization, but there is also a Christian worldview put over that. So this is important to understand, because amongst some, there is a belief that scythe was practiced primarily by women, and that may be true, but that it was considered effeminate for men to practice it, and it was shameful for men to practice it. But we know from like grave diggings and stuff like that that um, the roles of Norse men and women in the pre-Christian era were much more egalitarian, right? Women could own property, they could divorce their husbands, they kept the money in the family. There we have burials of women, not just legends, but burial of female warriors who were buried as like war chieftains. And so uh, the idea of these like strict gender roles, we don't know if that just came from sort of during the era when this stuff was written down. The practice of seiðr was actually punishable by death. So when Christianity came through and took over, the old ways of doing things were generally outlawed. And so it is possible that they were like, yeah, men don't do this. We're manly men. We can't go into trance and talk to gods and goddesses, and that would be anti-Christian anyway. And we'll be put to death if we find out about that. Not only will you be put to death, we will call you emasculine. We will use a term that is for masculinity, which is quite considered insulting in this age, right? But the interesting thing is in the writings of the gods and goddesses, Odin, who is the king, ostensibly the king, the leader of the Aesir, the gods that were in charge, took over from the Vanir. They Odin practices seiðr. He learns it from Freya, right? And he practices it. And Odin does all this stuff, like all this self-sacrifice to gain wisdom and power, right? He gives up his eye to at Mimir's well to get vision, and he hangs himself from the world tree to collect and bring the runes, right? So there's a lot about like uh, transgression. One of the reasons I love Odin is that he's very transgressive, as are many of the gods and goddesses in the Norse stories. Very transgressive about our ideas about what's okay, and some of the writings are, oh, it's really shameful because he's doing this soothsaying. But Odin did all kinds of things. He did, he picked up the runes and taught them to people as how to use them for spells. He stole the meat of poetry. He, the legends are really great. And if you want an easily accessible book about Norse gods and goddesses, check out Neil Gaiman's book on Norse mythology. Just fantastic. I have both the hardcover and his audio version, which he reads. It's very delightful. So say, again, covers many different practices or things. And one of the issues with having a belief system or sense of spirituality that isn't based on a book is that it changes a lot over time. And I have to believe that in ancient times, because there wasn't as much written dogma or legend or that sort of thing, and everything was word of mouth, there probably was great shift, just like there's great shift in languages, particularly pre-written languages. Not that, I mean, Norse could be written with runes, but generally stuff wasn't written down. It was, engraved upon. If you were really rich, you had a sword with your, an engraving on it, or you had a stone erected with runes on it to honor you, or what have you. But we don't have books of stuff written in runes. So the religious system wasn't written down, so probably most likely passed word of mouth. And so there were probably huge shifts in beliefs between peoples, times, geographic regions, all of those things. I think the idea of saying this is what seiðr was, this is what it referred to, period, across a very wide group of people, across a very wide group of time. And remember that these people, the Vikings were genetically diverse, more genetically diverse than the people in Scandinavia, living in Scandinavia today, meaning that they were incorporating people from their journeys. They were bringing people in and probably importing parts of culture, that sort of thing. Even the runes are certainly based on older lettering systems. It's why many of them resemble the letters we have today, that are considered Roman letters, but there were letters before that and letters before that. Um, so, uh, so the Latin letters that we have, a lot of them will resemble the runes that have sort of the same letter sound, right? So there were cross-cultural influences, there were changes over time. There was the fact that it was, passed down mostly orally, as were all of the legends that were written down, all of the stories of the gods and goddesses and things like that were passed down orally. In fact, remembering poetry was a pretty big deal back then in many cultures, not just Norse culture. So that's a little bit of an overview. So we have seiðr, we have high seiðr, which is what a lot of people think of when they hear that term, which is the person sitting in the high seat, the ritual seat, and doing divination for a whole gathering of people, much more formalized. And then you had people that people went to for soothsaying or for magical purposes, things like interacting with the weather, or providing victory in battle, or helping the crops grow, or the cattle, or whatever, or interceding with the Holder folk, which is also a term used for people who did seiðr, but also a term used for spirits like elves and things like that, the hidden folk. So anyway, that's seiðr. That's a little bit about Norse shamanism. I'll have many more talks on this, as it's something I study and practice myself. So look forward to that in the future. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You can also join and get some members only videos if that interests you, amongst other perks. Anyway, I'll talk to you really soon. Take care.